If you take a look at Disneyland's Tomorrowland today, it doesn't really seem to represent the look into the future the name suggests. When the land first opened in 1955, it was supposed to be factual, a look towards the exciting future dreamt of in the 1950s. But as Disneyland aged, and the future it promised started to arrive, the hopeful look to tomorrow found itself very quickly becoming tired and outdated. And the park had its first encounter with what is known today as the Tomorrowland problem. Disney did update Tomorrowland for the new future, only really pushing the problem further down the road. And when the land became outdated once again, it eventually decided to just turn it into a fictional sci-fi theme of a tomorrow that never was. But this too created a new set of problems the land is still dealing with today. Across all of the Disney parks it features in, Tomorrowland is now a weird mess of space and alien themed rides, miscellaneous Disney IP that doesn't fit a futuristic theme at all, and in some parks, neglected and abandoned attractions sitting deserted in plain view. I touched on this idea briefly in my video on the failure of Disneyland's rocket rods, but since making that video, I've wanted to return to Tomorrowland as a whole. Tell the story of the continuous battle it's fought to remain relevant across all of its versions, the new updates Disney's brought and the way they too became dated, the ways Disney has tried to solve the Tomorrowland problem, and the new problems the company has created in the process. In 1965, Disneyland celebrated its 10th anniversary. The park had already seen numerous changes. New rides opening, old rides closing, and even entire massive expansions to different parts of the park to grow the offerings at Disney's first ever theme park. But amid the celebrations in Southern California, Disneyland's Tomorrowland had developed an issue. Tomorrowland had opened as Disneyland's factual view of the future, its attractions grounded in reality, teaching guests about new technologies and innovations that would become relevant in their lifetimes. It had suffered from an incredibly rushed construction, as had most of Disneyland, but Tomorrowland especially, with its construction actually being cancelled in late 1954 and suddenly restarted only 6 months before opening day. Opening with only 2 main buildings, housing a slim number of exhibits mainly showcasing the innovations of corporate sponsors, and 2 outdoor attractions, with a 3rd indoor attraction, the Rocket to the Moon, to open a week later. Tomorrowland had spent the last 10 years gradually building out its offerings from the barren land it was in 1955, with some more corporate-sponsored exhibits, like 1957's Monsanto House of the Future, showing off future home appliances like the microwave oven, miscellaneous smaller attractions like the spinning Astrojets ride, and most notably a 1959 expansion to the land that added the submarine voyage ride, the world's first tubular steel roller coaster, the Matterhorn bobsleds, and an example of future rapid transportation whizzing above the land, the Disneyland monorail. But now, 10 years on from its opening, the present day had seemingly caught up to Disneyland's world of the future. One of the major openings in 1955 had been Autopia, one of those 2 outdoor attractions. This one allowing guests to drive miniature cars on a highway, an emerging style of road that was sure to shape Americans' lives in the coming decades. But by 1965, highway travel wasn't so much a vision of tomorrow as it was a fact of today. The Rocket to the Moon attraction had also provided the guests of the 50s a glimpse into the potential of space travel, a theatre attraction with screens in the floor and ceiling simulating a trip to the moon. But in 1961, the Mercury Redstone 3 rocket had put the first American into space, and by comparison, Rocket to the Moon and the massive atomic age moonliner that stood outside its entrance no longer represented the forefront of space travel. It just looked fake, because it was. The attraction's sponsor, Transworld Airlines, had dropped its sponsorship of Rocket to the Moon that same year. And while it would find a new sponsor shortly after, leading to a repaint of the rocket, it too had suffered a major blow to its futurism. Some of the futurist exhibits in Tomorrowland's main buildings, like Space Station X-1, a model of North America from space, and the corporate-sponsored Kaiser Aluminium Hall of Fame, a display of the many uses of aluminium, had already left the park by 1960. Others, like the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, a corporate-sponsored walkthrough of the wonders of plastic production, had simply become very boring. If, an exhibit on plastics hadn't been boring already. And there were also several things in Tomorrowland that didn't really fit the view of the near future at all. Mostly relics of the panic to fill the empty space in the very early years of Disneyland. A walkthrough of props from the 1954 movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The Dutch Boy Paint Gallery, an exhibit on the wonders of lead paint. And the Flight Circle, an area used for demonstrations of model planes. Disneyland had had its first taste of the Tomorrowland problem. A land promising a glimpse towards the future will eventually be caught up with by the present. In the early 60s, expansion of Tomorrowland had slowed down, as Disney chose to focus its efforts on the upcoming 1964 New York World's Fair, and eventually on a new project to be built far from Disneyland in Central Florida, building on the ideas of Tomorrowland to create a real functioning city of tomorrow. And while the 60s did see some additions in Disneyland's East Quadrant, like the 1961 opening of the Flying Saucers, by the park's 10th anniversary, Tomorrowland was looking outdated and a little neglected. And so in 1965, with the World's Fair out of the way and the Florida project announced to the public, Disney was finally ready to address their Tomorrowland problem, close the aging attractions of the previous decade, and rebuild nearly everything for the new future of the 60s and hopefully beyond. In 1966, construction began on a complete overhaul of Tomorrowland, demolishing several buildings and expanding and modifying others. The Monsanto Hall of Chemistry was replaced by the dark ride Adventure Through Inner Space, taking guests on a journey through the molecular world. Still a connection to Monsanto's chemical production, but from an updated, more exciting perspective. The Flying Saucers were closed, as they had been too unreliable and inefficient to operate. So too was the Monsanto House of the Future, which stuck around until December before its demolition. A brand new building replaced the long-standing quick-service restaurant The Space Bar to house the Carousel of Progress, an animatronic show brought over from the New York World's Fair, showing the development of technology in the American household over the last 60 years, ending with the modern age and a look towards the future. The original Tomorrowland had been set in 1986, the year of the next arrival of Halley's Comet, but New Tomorrowland chose to replace this setting with a different defining theme, World on the Move, and several of the other new attractions focused on different forms of transportation. Under this theme, Autopia would also be able to stick around, as despite the development of highway travel, the ride was incredibly popular in the park, and alongside it, a new transportation ride was built named the People Mover, continuously moving vehicles weaving through the entire land on tracks above, a demonstration of a new rapid transit system to complement the existing monorail. The aging rocket to the moon was brought into the new space age of the 60s, completely redesigned as Flight to the Moon, a similar theatre attraction, but now with larger theatres and a new audio-animatronic pre-show taking place in a NASA-inspired mission control. And lastly, the old Moonliner rocket was demolished, and instead, the new space rocket in the land would be the decorative centerpiece of the rocket jets. The successor to the Astrojets sat above the People Mover station, now also themed after the real-life NASA rockets. And the whole of the land, in a decorative sense, took on a space-age aesthetic. New Tomorrowland opened in 1967. As the biggest change to Disneyland since its opening. Clean, focused, and importantly, futuristic in its design, finally overcoming the problems the rushed 55 opening had created. Walt Disney, however, would not see its opening, as he had passed away in December 1966 before construction had been finished. And with his passing, the park and the plans for his real Tomorrowland in Florida would be left to his brother Roy to continue work on. In October 1971, Walt Disney World opened its doors, the Florida project that had been announced to the public in the mid-60s, the self-titled Vacation Kingdom of the World, a large resort containing hotels, recreational activities, and Disney's second ever theme park, Magic Kingdom. The promised City of Tomorrow, named EPCOT, would be built at a later date. Magic Kingdom largely followed the same design patterns as Disneyland, bringing another castle and most of the same themed lands and attractions, including Disney's second version of Tomorrowland. Just like Disneyland's had been in the 50s, Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland was very bare bones when it opened. Two buildings carrying a similar aesthetic to Disneyland's 67 redo, one for the Circle Vision show America the Beautiful, and the other with a clone of Flight to the Moon, which actually wouldn't open until December. A station for Disney World's longer version of the Skyway and the Grand Prix Raceway, a new version of Autopia, but with a racing theme. With the exception of Flight to the Moon, nothing in this new Tomorrowland really represented tomorrow, and even Flight to the Moon was now showing its age, as since its opening in Disneyland, the Apollo programs had successfully landed humans on the moon several times. It would take Disney until 1975 to address this problem, when Flight to the Moon was reopened as Mission to Mars, having lasted 8 years at Disneyland, 6 of them post-moon landing, and only 4 years at Disney World. Essentially the same attraction, but with an updated destination. That year would also bring the expansion of Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland, first with the opening of the Carousel of Progress, which had closed in Disneyland in 1973 due to declining interest, and had been replaced over there by America Sings, a singing animatronic show containing popular songs from American history, but a show that had absolutely nothing to do with tomorrow. And on the very same day, Disney World would receive its first roller coaster, with the opening of Space Mountain, an indoor coaster in darkness, decorated with more generic Apollo-ish space travel theming. And in the summer, the land received its own version of the People Mover. In 1977, Space Mountain was also brought to Disneyland, alongside a space-themed video arcade named the Starcade. Space Mountain was an enormously successful addition to both parks, and it was also one that didn't directly reference any particular coming technology, just the broader idea of space travel. America's last crewed mission to the moon had concluded in 1972, and by the middle of the decade, the space race that had influenced much of the 67 Tomorrowland design had died down. However, 2 days before the opening of Disneyland's Space Mountain, a new kind of interest in space would be ignited across America. A more fictional, fantastical kind, as the movie Star Wars released to the public. A broader view of space travel seemed like a pretty safe bet for the land of the late 70s, not least because the early 80s would bring a new addition to Disney World that would take over many of the future technology themes of Tomorrowland. In 1982, Walt Disney's final dream, EPCOT, opened at Disney World. Changing budgets, priorities, and the loss of Walt Disney had prevented EPCOT from actually becoming the city of tomorrow it was supposed to be, and instead, it was Disney World's second theme park, named Epcot Center, and themed in part to an optimistic look towards future technologies and the world of tomorrow. Epcot's future world was a more modern, larger version of the original ideals of Tomorrowland, now also including a technology that Tomorrowland had barely even touched on, the computer. 1983 brought a third Tomorrowland, as Disney's first international theme park, Tokyo Disneyland, opened its doors. Much like the rest of the park, the Tomorrowland in Japan was largely copied from the existing ones in America. In addition to the now typical Space Mountain and Autopia, Tokyo did have 2 unique attractions. One of them, the Eternal Sea, an ultra-widescreen film about Japan's relationship with the sea, and the other, Meet the World, a rotating animatronic theatre show similar to the Carousel of Progress, telling the history of Japan and its relationship to the outside world. Both interesting attractions with their own long stories, but they were ones that didn't really fit into either of the 2 standard Tomorrowland themes. As the 80s continued, Tomorrowland decided to embrace science fiction over science fact, but only in small ways. In 1986, the sci-fi musical Captain EO opened in Disneyland, also showing in Epcot, and in 1987, Disneyland received the motion simulator ride Star Tours, replacing Adventure Through Inner Space, some of the first additions to Disney theme parks under the company's new CEO, Michael Eisner, who was undertaking a massive revitalization of Disney. Star Tours in particular was a significant addition to Tomorrowland, as Star Wars was the land's first ever implementation of a pre-existing IP. Unfortunately, the 80s sci-fi editions hadn't done enough to set Tomorrowland on a path towards timelessness, and the rest of the land in 1989 had fallen again into neglect. The space age aesthetic, which had once been fresh, was now just as old as the atomic age look before it. America Sings had closed in 1988, and its building was now sitting empty. The People Mover and the monorail still took guests happily above the land, but to a newer generation, they were sedate, not representative of the fast-paced future now imagined for the 90s. Just like had happened in the mid-60s, the future had become old. Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland 2 had seen very little attention since the addition of Space Mountain. The 1972 attraction If You Had Wings, which, by the way, was only about modern-day air travel, had recently acquired a new sponsor and had reopened as Delta Dreamflight. But aside from that, and a new Circle Vision film, there had been no new attractions in the 80s. If Eisner's new, modern Disney was to find a more permanent fix for the seemingly eternal, cyclical decline of Tomorrowland, it needed to do more than just add a few new rides. It needed to radically redesign the land once again, but this time in a way that could fully separate it from the science factual once and for all. And thankfully, the early 90s would provide the company with a new opportunity to do just that. In 1992, Euro Disneyland opened just outside of Paris, France, the 4th Disney destination, containing now theme park number 6, and its 4th attempt at Tomorrowland. Kind of, as turning east from the hub in this park, guests would find themselves at the entrance to Discoveryland, a new interpretation of the Tomorrowland concept, a fictional view of the future inspired by the writings of French science fiction author Jules Verne, as well as some of his contemporaries. Something Disney hoped would also endear them to the local audience. Technically, Discoveryland wasn't completely new, as it had reused plans from a cancelled land for Disneyland named Discovery Bay. But that's a story I don't really have time to go into right now. In the land, guests could find attractions like Le Visionarium, a circle vision and animatronic show taking them on a time-traveling journey across Europe. Orbitron and Autopia, both versions of the classic Rocket Jet and Autopia attractions from America, but now bathed in striking steampunk-esque architecture. And a few years after opening, Discoveryland would open the Mysteries of the Nautilus, and Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon, both based on the worlds of Jules Verne. Discoveryland had done what Tomorrowland had half-heartedly tried to do in the 80s, and fully dropped the old science fact ideas. It still had futurist concepts like space travel, but they were no longer space race themed. And stylistically, it made a lot of sense. A staple of Tomorrowland, like the rocket jets or Autopia, could happily exist in the park without feeling like it belonged to a bygone era or had been misplaced. Captain EO and Star Tours did still make appearances, neither of which were particularly consistent with the theme, but Disney had managed to bypass a large part of the Tomorrowland problem. Around the same time as the opening of Discoveryland, attention was turned back to California, and hoping to create a timeless version of the original Tomorrowland, Disney Imagineering drew up plans for the biggest change to the area since 1967. The third iteration in California was to be named Tomorrowland 2055. Instead of a Jules Verne look, Tomorrowland 2055 would turn the land into an alien spaceport, a hub for travel across the galaxy, set during the 100th birthday of Disneyland, still technically creating an expiration date for the theme, but one that was much further away. New attractions would include Plek2's Intergalactic Review, an alien musical animatronic show filling in the space left by America Sings, an Americanized version of Le Visionarium from Discoveryland to take over the Circle Vision Theatre currently showing the film American Journeys, and to replace Mission to Mars, a high-intensity special effects and animatronics attraction taking place in the same theatre named Extraterrestrial Alien Encounter, giving guests a close and frightening meeting with a carnivorous alien. Attractions like Star Tours and Space Mountain would stick around too, but with slight rethemes, becoming departure points in the spaceport to their respective worlds. Unfortunately, the Tomorrowland 2055 project would never make it to Disneyland. By 1993, Euro Disneyland was facing tremendous financial difficulties from a very poor initial reception in Europe, despite the park's fantastic design, and Disney were forced to cancel and scale back many of their 90s projects to cope with the losses. Instead, some of the ideas for Tomorrowland 2055 were modified and moved to the equally neglected Tomorrowland of Disney World, where in 1994, that park opened its own, slightly reduced version of New Tomorrowland, bringing the alien spaceport to life, not set in any specific year, with maximalist, colourful, neon-clad architecture, and a heavy emphasis on that alien feel. Also partially inspired by the sci-fi themes of the 50s, in a way bringing back some of the ideas of the original Atomic Age Tomorrowland. just now from a retro-futurist perspective. Magic Kingdom's new Tomorrowland would finally bring Le Visionarium stateside as the timekeeper. It would also open a new version of the Starjets, similar to Discoveryland's Orbitron, named Astro Orbiter, opened above Magic Kingdom's People Mover, which itself was renamed the Tomorrowland Transit Authority, with new scenes visible from the windows of different alien businesses. Space Mountain had its queue rethemed to make the ride serve as the principal departure point of the spaceport. And in 1995, Extraterrestrial Alien Encounter opened in the place of Mission to Mars, Disney's new, scariest attraction. Plec2's Intergalactic Review had been cancelled, and the Carousel of Progress survived the Tomorrowland retheme, but it too received an update in 1994, which, among other smaller changes, turned the final scene into a Christmas scene of the year 2000, still keeping around one small element of the realistic look towards the near future. Just like in Paris, Magic Kingdom was addressing its Tomorrowland problem by focusing on the fictional. And while it was more cartoony and less sophisticated than the 2055 design, it was a very positive change for Disney World. All that was needed now was for something to happen with Disneyland. After a few more years spent in decline, the original Tomorrowland received its own much-needed redesign at the end of the 90s. The third major iteration of the land, opening in May 1998, but one that had been severely affected by the Euro-Disney-related budget cuts. The Disneyland redesign took heavy inspiration from Discoveryland, with a similar Jules Verne aesthetic, but just without any direct references to the author. The whole land, including Space Mountain, painted in copper tones, also carrying a design trend frequently referred to with the name neo-agrarian, basically a future agriculture design, vegetable patches placed around the land, reducing a bit of the emphasis on cities, transportation, and the hard steel infrastructure of the Tomorrowland of the past, for a softer, more environmentally conscious design fitting of the late 90s. Because of the reduced budget though, the new design had mostly just been a redressing of the 60s buildings. Most of Tomorrowland 98's new attractions were also copied from other parks. Captain EO was replaced by Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, a 4D show brought over from EPCOT. The rocket jets were demolished and replaced with another version of Astro Orbiter, this time on the ground at the entrance to the land. The space above the People Mover instead used for a spinning sculpture named the Observatron, and the vacant America Sings building was filled with a Disneyland version of Emergence, the showcase of future technologies that opened in EPCOT in 1994. Surprisingly, something that did fit the original purpose of Tomorrowland, even if it had been simply because it was from EPCOT. Tomorrowland 98, though, did have one new ride that was unique to Disneyland, replacing the Circle Vision Theatre and the much-loved People Mover, a high-speed thrill ride taking place on the same track layout named Rocket Rods. And elsewhere, Tomorrowland also held a tribute to its past self. Mission to Mars was not replaced with a new ride, but in its place, guests could visit Red Rocket's Pizza Port restaurant, decorated inside with posters of former Tomorrowland attractions, including the Skyway, which had closed permanently in 1994, and decorated outside with a new version of the iconic TWA Moonliner, albeit at a slightly smaller scale. While the 98 redesign had some interesting ideas, the land was not well received by guests. The copper, or really brown, colouring was ugly, and clearly just laid over the existing buildings. Some attractions, like Submarine Voyage, had closed and were replaced with nothing, and what was supposed to be the biggest addition of the redo, Rocket Rods, was immediately beset by mechanical issues. partially related to the ride overstressing the old track layout meant for the slower people mover Disney didn't have the budget to replace. Video about the full history of rocket rods available on my channel. Disneyland's Tomorrowland had managed to update itself once again for the modern age, but it hadn't done it well, and it likely wouldn't be very long before it would be in need of another refresh. As the 21st century, the future many had so often dreamed about, finally arrived, Rocket Rods closed. After only 2 years in the park. Its track, too deeply ingrained into the whole of the land and too expensive to remove, was simply left where it was, abandoned and unused. Eventually in 2005, its queue was used for the new spinning dark ride Buzz Lightyear Astro Blasters, a version of Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin which had opened in Florida in 1998, replacing Delta Dreamflight. Its arrival also brought a repaint of Tomorrowland, removing the ugly brown and copper and returning to a similar colour scheme as in the 60s. Much like Space Mountain before it, Buzz Lightyear was a hugely successful addition to both Disneyland and Magic Kingdom, also opening in 2004 in Tokyo and 2006 in Paris, replacing Le Visionarium. Although different from Space Mountain, it was also the latest success of an IP in Tomorrowland. Something started back in the 80s with Star Tours, and if Star Tours had begun the IP takeover of Tomorrowland, Buzz Lightyear would really open the floodgates. 2005 also brought yet another Tomorrowland to the world as Hong Kong Disneyland opened its doors. Somewhat similar in design to Discoveryland and 98 Disneyland, but without much of a cohesive theme, simply bringing the most recognizable attractions from America over to Hong Kong. Magic Kingdom's extraterrestrial alien encounter was replaced in 2004 by a much more family-friendly alien, in Stitch's Great Escape. In 2007, Florida's Timekeeper made way for Monsters Inc. Laugh Floor, a show that fit into Tomorrowland because it had monsters, I guess? Accompanied that same year by the long-awaited replacement to the vacant submarine voyage in Disneyland, named Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage, which fit Tomorrowland because it had fish, I guess. By this point, IP inclusion had become what Tomorrowland, and really the whole of the Disney parks, had settled on. A particular push by Disney's new CEO since 2005, Bob Iger. By the 2010s, Star Wars and Marvel were the main properties that were showing up. From 2015 to 2017, Space Mountain received a Star Wars overlay named Hyperspace Mountain across Disneyland, Hong Kong Disneyland, and Disneyland Paris, eventually becoming permanent in Hong Kong and Paris. And the now aging technologies of Interventions were replaced with the Star Wars Launch Bay meet and greet. The Marvel attractions were mainly present in Hong Kong, where multiple Marvel rides opened near each other in the late 2010s. The Tomorrowlands of the 2010s were almost unrecognizable from the original look towards the future they had once sought to cultivate. And in 2016, the final Tomorrowland to date would look even less familiar. Shanghai Disneyland in China opened without many of the typical Tomorrowland attractions. No Autopia, and no Space Mountain. Instead, much of the land was centered around a new roller coaster named Tron Lightcycle Power Run. The land also ditched the holdover Discoveryland aesthetic for a completely new, concrete-laden grey and white design of the new digital future of the 2010s. In 2023, the ride was also brought to Magic Kingdom as Tron Lightcycle Run, opening next to Space Mountain. In the modern day, Tomorrowland has continued to focus on its fantasy themes, now led almost entirely by IP that only sometimes fits with an incredibly general, futuristic theme. And I fear that once again, we've arrived where we were in the late 80s and early 90s, but this time for different reasons. Many of the Tomorrowlands today feel tired and neglected, not because they feature technologies that no longer represent the future, but because they don't feature anything at all. When the lands reinvented themselves in the 90s, they did so with cohesive storylines. The intention was that new rides could still fit into the Alien Spaceport or the Jules Verne theme, because these were more timeless settings that wouldn't age so quickly. But in the past 20 or so years, these settings feel like they've been all but abandoned. Now, it's not like the Tomorrowlands of the past didn't have attractions that didn't fit. As I hope you've seen in this video, they did. But I feel like this issue is so much more exaggerated now than it was back then. I'm not totally against the inclusion of IP in theme parks. There's plenty of IP rides that I really love, and I think do belong in the Disney parks. Space Ranger Spin has been one of my favourite Magic Kingdom attractions for a very long time. And I also think, in the case of Shanghai, the argument for getting rid of something like Autopia makes a lot of sense, considering how, even though it is now something that's kind of become its own thing, it was technically a relic of when highway technology was new and exciting. But the inclusion of IP needs to be done thoughtfully, and with an eye for how each attraction fits with the ones around it. In a way, Disney has now kind of solved its Tomorrowland problem, but by doing so, it's created a number of new ones. Beyond land cohesion, the neglect is also apparent to me in quite a few of the parks. In Hong Kong, Disney seems to have given up on the land entirely, as of 2025, opting to expand the park's Marvel attractions to spin them off into their own land named Stark Expo. I'm still a big fan of Discoveryland in Paris, but it does have a problem that a lot of the main park in Paris has, which is that it's barely received any new attractions over its entire history. I don't feel Hyperspace Mountain can really be counted as a new addition, as it's just an overlay of Space Mountain, nor can the 2017 update of Star Tours, meaning the only new attraction since 2006 is Mickey's PhilharMagic, which is a Fantasyland attraction from Magic Kingdom. Speaking of Magic Kingdom, Stitch's Great Escape closed in 2018, and aside from a temporary meet and greet, as of right now it's been replaced with nothing. And the biggest problem is in Disneyland, which is still suffering from the difficulty of the 98 redo. Honey, I Shrunk the Audience was replaced by a return of Captain EO in the early 2010s, and later a short compilation of moments from the Star Wars movies named Path of the Jedi. But the theatre now sits closed. So too does the Starcade, visible from the queue of Space Mountain, blocked off from guests. Star Wars Launch Bay closed in 2020 and now only houses a DVC members lounge. The Observatron sculpture that was built above Rocket Rods has been switched off since the early 2010s. And of course, Rocket Rods itself has been sitting abandoned above the land since 2001. Really a terrible look for Disney's Tomorrowland. This leads me to the difficult question of, how do you actually fix Tomorrowland? And I kind of think you can't. Without renaming it Spaceland or Alienland, the element of tomorrow and the difficulty determining what that really represents is always going to be present. I do think the idea of retro-futurism helps both address the aging of the land while still making it fit the ideals of the world of tomorrow. Enough time has passed now that I think Disney could return Disneyland's Tomorrowland to a similar look as it had in 1967, but emphasizing the fantasy elements of that era's depiction of the future. There was some talk of this sort of idea in 2025 with the success of the Fantastic Four movie, and there have been rumors of this sort of a reset in Disneyland for a few years now. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in my Rocket Rods video, any renovation would likely mean the closure of the entire land. And so, with how disruptive that would be, It's likely Disney is trying to avoid doing this as much as possible. The future is not lost for Tomorrowland though, and I do want to look ahead with some positive news for the various lands. In Tokyo, Space Mountain is currently undergoing a major refurbishment, which will update both the inside and outside of the ride to once again bring the feeling of the land forward to a modern style of futurism. And more recently in Magic Kingdom, in 2026, Disney announced that the Carousel of Progress would receive its first major refurbishment since 1994, updating the eras of the ride to try and maintain its relevance to current generations, including a look towards the near future. So, as time moves ever onwards, the Tomorrowland problem may look slightly different than in the 50s, but it still exists, because ultimately, tomorrow always arrives. I didn't set out to write a total and complete history of every individual change in all of the Tomorrowlands over the years, and you'll probably notice that there were some attractions I left out, but I hope that you have enjoyed it. A massive thank you to my Patreon members for supporting what I do here on YouTube. If you'd like to join the Patreon to get access to exclusive monthly bonus videos, you can find out more at the link in the description. Also, I have another very important thing to say this time, which is thank you so much for 90,000 subscribers. That's a very crazy number to think about, and we're also very close to that big YouTube milestone of 100,000. So again, thank you to everyone who's subscribed so far, and if you're not already and you want to join on the way to 100,000, please consider hitting subscribe. Lastly, there are always more videos about theme parks coming in the future, and as always, I'll see you next time.